The biggest lie about 2026 is the expectation that it will arrive in chaos. People are waiting for disorder, breakdown, panic, and obvious upheaval because chaos is easy to recognize. Chaos gives the illusion of clarity. It tells people when to pay attention. But real power never relies on chaos for long, because chaos invites resistance. What truly reshapes societies is not collapse, but calm. Not disruption, but adjustment. And that is why 2026 will not feel like a breaking point. It will feel like a settling point. For years, people have been conditioned to expect dramatic turning points, moments when everything suddenly changes and awareness is forced upon everyone at once. This expectation is comforting because it suggests there will be time to react. But history does not work that way. The most decisive shifts do not shock people into awareness. They lull them into acceptance. They happen quietly, incrementally, while life continues to function well enough to avoid alarm. The idea that chaos signals danger is misleading. Chaos is inefficient. Chaos destabilizes systems and invites scrutiny. Acceptance, on the other hand, stabilizes systems from within. When people accept new conditions psychologically, enforcement becomes unnecessary. Behavior adjusts naturally. Compliance feels voluntary. And by the time people realize how far things have moved, they no longer feel positioned to question it. This is why 2026 is misunderstood. It is not the beginning of something new. It is the point at which existing patterns solidify. By 2026, many changes introduced as temporary, necessary, or exceptional will simply feel normal. Not because people agree with them, but because they have learned how to live with them. Adaptation replaces outrage. Familiarity replaces concern. The most unsettling part is that many people will say nothing really happened, and they will be correct in the most dangerous way. Nothing dramatic will have happened. No single event will mark the moment. The shift will be psychological, not explosive. People will wake up in a world that feels recognizable, functional, and orderly, yet subtly narrower than before. This is how acceptance works. It does not ask permission. It waits for exhaustion. It relies on repetition. It leverages uncertainty. Over time, questioning begins to feel unnecessary, then impractical, then irresponsible. By 2026, many people will not feel controlled. They will feel realistic. They will believe they are simply adapting to the world as it is. The lie is believing that danger always announces itself loudly. The truth is that the most consequential changes arrive disguised as stability. They present themselves as solutions, as progress, as common sense. And because they do not feel threatening, they are rarely examined deeply. This chapter is not predicting disaster, it is predicting normalization. And normalization is far more powerful than fear. Fear provokes action. Normalization dissolves it. If you are expecting 2026 to shock you awake, you may already be missing what matters. Awareness does not arrive when something becomes obvious. It arrives when something still feels questionable. By the time acceptance is complete, awareness becomes retrospective rather than active. 2026 will not be remembered as the year everything fell apart. It will be remembered as the year everything quietly made sense. And that is why it matters. Acceptance does not arrive as agreement, it arrives as relief. When uncertainty drags on long enough, when pressure becomes constant, and when alternatives feel unclear or exhausting, the human mind seeks stability wherever it can find it. This is the psychological foundation on which acceptance is built. People do not wake up one day and decide to surrender standards or freedoms. They slowly recalibrate what feels tolerable, reasonable, and realistic. By the time acceptance is complete, it no longer feels like a choice, it feels like maturity. The process begins with repetition. Ideas that would once have provoked concern are introduced gently, framed as temporary or exceptional. At first, people object, then they adjust, then they stop noticing. Repetition dulls emotional response. What was once alarming becomes familiar, and familiarity breeds acceptance far more effectively than persuasion ever could. The mind interprets familiarity as safety, even when conditions are narrowing. Fatigue accelerates this process. When people are tired emotionally, financially, mentally, resistance feels expensive. Questioning requires energy. Sustained attention requires clarity. In a state of exhaustion, people prioritize what allows life to continue smoothly. Acceptance offers that smoothness. It removes friction. It allows people to get on with their lives without constant internal conflict. And so acceptance spreads not because it is right, but because it is easier. Language plays a crucial role in shaping acceptance. Changes are framed carefully to minimize emotional resistance. Words like temporary, necessary, responsible, and for your own good soften impact. Language does not merely describe reality, it prepares perception to receive it. Once the language is accepted, the conditions it describes feel less intrusive. People adapt to the frame before they examine the substance. Another powerful factor is comparison. Each new adjustment is compared not to what existed before the process began, but to the most recent change. This creates a moving baseline. The original standard fades from memory. What once would have felt unacceptable now feels moderate compared to what followed. Acceptance does not happen all at once. It happens by losing sight of where you started. Social reinforcement then locks acceptance in place. When most people around you appear to have adapted, resistance feels isolating. Silence spreads faster than dissent. People look to others for cues on how to feel. When acceptance becomes the dominant posture, questioning feels unnecessary or even disruptive. The group does not need to suppress dissent actively. Social comfort does the work. By 2026, this psychological process will be well advanced. Many people will not feel constrained. They will feel adjusted. They will describe themselves as pragmatic, realistic, and grounded. They will not say they have accepted less. They will say they have grown up. That is how acceptance hides itself. It disguises surrender as wisdom. The most unsettling aspect is that acceptance feels voluntary. People believe they are choosing adaptation freely, unaware of how the range of choice has narrowed. The illusion of agency remains intact, even as options quietly disappear. This is why acceptance is more powerful than force. Force provokes awareness. Acceptance dissolves it. This chapter is not an accusation. It is a description of human psychology under sustained pressure. Anyone can be shaped by it. The question is not whether acceptance will occur, but whether it will occur consciously or unconsciously. Awareness does not stop adaptation, but it prevents the mind from confusing adaptation with inevitability. By the time acceptance feels complete, resistance will no longer feel necessary. And that is why 2026 will not feel like a crisis. It will feel like a conclusion. One of the most misleading ways to think about 2026 is as a future turning point, a moment when something new suddenly begins. In reality, 2026 is far more likely to function as a confirmation, the point at which processes already in motion become stable enough to stop being questioned. Beginnings are visible, confirmations are quiet. They don't announce themselves because they no longer need to persuade. They simply exist as the accepted state of affairs. People often imagine change as a line, before and after. But large-scale shifts move more like a tide. They advance gradually, reshaping the shoreline long before anyone notices the water has moved. By the time the tide feels permanent, the movement that caused it is already complete. That is what 2026 represents. Not the start of change, but the moment when change feels settled. This is why many people will look around in 2026 and say, things have been like this for a while, and they will be right. The most important transitions will already have happened psychologically. Expectations will have adjusted, language will have shifted, boundaries will have been redrawn incrementally. What remains in 2026 is not debate, but management, how to live efficiently inside conditions that now feel normal. Confirmation is powerful because it closes questions without answering them. Once something is confirmed socially, questioning it feels redundant. People assume the discussion is over. Attention moves on. The mind reallocates energy from inquiry to adaptation. This is how acceptance becomes durable. It no longer depends on argument or enforcement. It is maintained by routine. Another reason 2026 functions as confirmation is memory erosion. By then, the original reference point, how things used to be, will feel distant. People will struggle to articulate exactly what changed or when. They will remember discomfort, controversy, or a difficult period, but not the specific steps that led to the present. Without a clear memory of the baseline, resistance loses direction. You cannot oppose what you cannot clearly define. This is also why 2026 will not feel dramatic. Drama belongs to transitions, not confirmations. Drama requires tension. By 2026, much of the tension will have been resolved internally. People will have made peace with adjustments, even if reluctantly. The emotional charge will be lower, replaced by resignation or pragmatism. And in that emotional calm, the shift locks in place. Importantly, confirmation does not require universal agreement. It only requires widespread resignation. People do not need to approve. They only need to stop objecting. Once objection feels pointless, confirmation is complete. And that point is often reached quietly, without celebration or protest. This chapter matters because it reframes the urgency of awareness. If you are waiting for 2026 to reveal what is happening, you are treating confirmation as revelation. But revelation comes earlier, when patterns are still forming and resistance still feels possible. Confirmation arrives when awareness is no longer actionable, only explanatory. That does not mean 2026 is meaningless. It means it is decisive in a different way. It is the year many people will realize, without fully articulating it, that the argument has moved on, that certain questions are no longer being asked, that the environment has changed not through force but through familiarity. For those who notice early, 2026 will feel like validation rather than surprise, not satisfaction but recognition, the sense of this is what it was leading to. And that recognition will carry a quiet weight because it confirms that awareness mattered most before things felt settled. 2026 is not the beginning of the story. It is the moment the story stops asking for permission. And once confirmation replaces debate, the direction no longer feels negotiable, only manageable. The most unsettling aspect of what leads into 2026 is that choice does not vanish. It contracts. People often imagine loss of freedom as something dramatic: bans, force, visible coercion. But what actually happens is far more subtle. Options remain, but only within an increasingly narrow frame. People can still choose, but only between outcomes that have already been pre-selected. This creates the impression of autonomy while quietly removing meaningful alternatives. When choice shrinks gradually, it rarely feels like loss. It feels like realism. People tell themselves they are adjusting to circumstances, making sensible decisions within a changing world. They do not notice that the range of what is possible has been quietly reduced. This is how control becomes sustainable. It allows people to feel responsible for decisions that were already constrained. By 2026, many people will still believe they are living freely because they can decide how to act, where to participate, and what to prioritize. Yet the deeper question of what kind of world those choices exist within will feel settled. Once the frame is accepted, the choices inside it feel natural. People debate tactics, preferences, and strategies while no longer questioning direction. This narrowing of choice is reinforced psychologically. Humans adapt quickly to new limits when those limits are introduced gradually. Each reduction is compared to the previous state, not to the original baseline. Over time, the baseline is forgotten. What once felt restrictive now feels ordinary. And what once felt ordinary becomes unimaginable. Social reinforcement accelerates this process. When most people accept a narrowed frame, dissent feels impractical. Those who question the shrinking of options are told they are unrealistic, nostalgic, or resistant to progress. Over time, the cost of questioning feels higher than the benefit. Silence spreads not because people agree, but because they no longer believe alternatives are viable. This is why by 2026, many people will not describe themselves as constrained. They will describe themselves as adapted. They will say they are making the best of reality, being responsible, or doing what makes sense. The language of acceptance replaces the language of freedom. without anyone declaring that freedom is gone. The most powerful illusion is that nothing has been taken away. And technically, that may be true. What has changed is context. When context shifts, choices change, meaning a decision made freely within a narrow frame feels the same as one made freely within a wide frame until you compare what is no longer possible. But comparison fades as memory fades. This is why resistance becomes rare at this stage. People are not being forced, they are being guided. They are not being told what to think. They are being shown what is reasonable. Once reasonableness is defined externally, internal choice aligns automatically. This chapter is not about despair. It is about clarity. Choice still exists, but it exists differently. And understanding that difference is crucial. Those who recognize shrinking frames can still navigate them consciously. Those who do not will confuse limitation with inevitability. By the time choice feels naturally narrow, questioning it feels strange. People adapt not because they are weak, but because adaptation feels safer than imagining alternatives that no longer seem accessible. And this leads directly to the next realization, because once choice shrinks far enough, questioning itself begins to carry risk. Not legal risk, not immediate punishment, but social and psychological cost. That is where the shift deepens further. There is a moment in every long transition when questioning does not disappear, but changes character. It stops feeling curious and starts feeling risky. Not illegal, not overtly punished, but socially costly. This is the stage where people still can ask questions, but increasingly choose not to. The environment signals, subtly and repeatedly, that certain lines of inquiry are unnecessary, outdated, or disruptive. Over time, people internalize those signals and begin editing themselves before anyone else has to. This shift is not driven by fear in the dramatic sense. It is driven by discomfort. Questioning introduces friction into conversations that are expected to flow smoothly. It challenges assumptions that others rely on to feel stable. In a world already saturated with stress and uncertainty, friction is unwelcome. People learn that raising certain questions changes the mood of a room, marks them as difficult, or creates distance. And because humans are social beings, most choose connection over confrontation. Language plays a critical role here. Questioning is reframed not as inquiry, but as negativity. Skepticism becomes cynicism. Doubt becomes irresponsibility. The question itself is no longer addressed. The person asking it is. This shift discourages exploration without banning it outright. The cost is reputational rather than legal, but reputational cost is often enough. By 2026, this dynamic will be deeply embedded. Many people will still sense that something is off, but they will struggle to articulate it publicly, not because they lack words, but because the words feel unwelcome. They will tell themselves it's not the right time, that the issue has already been settled, or that speaking up won't change anything. Silence becomes framed as maturity, and caution is mistaken for wisdom. This is how normalization completes itself. Once questioning feels inappropriate, the shift no longer needs to justify itself. It is protected by social consensus rather than authority. Debate may continue on the surface about implementation, efficiency, or optimization, but foundational questions quietly vanish. The conversation narrows without appearing to close. What makes this phase especially effective is that many people feel relieved when questioning subsides. Uncertainty is tiring. Open questions demand emotional energy. When society signals that something is settled, people can stop wrestling with it internally. They can focus on coping rather than understanding. That relief is seductive, and once chosen, awareness recedes further. Importantly, this does not require uniform agreement. It requires only that enough people decide the cost of questioning is too high. Once that threshold is crossed, dissent becomes sporadic, fragmented, and easily dismissed. Those who continue to question are not silenced. They are sidelined. Their concerns are framed as personal issues rather than collective ones. This chapter matters because it explains why the absence of protest is not proof of consent. Silence often signals adaptation, not agreement. And adaptation under pressure is not the same as free choice. When questioning feels dangerous socially, emotionally, or psychologically, the shift has already passed its most critical phase. By the time something is obvious, questioning it feels pointless. The window for meaningful inquiry has closed, not with a bang, but with a shrug. People move on. Not because they are convinced, but because they are tired. And that is why awareness must arrive early. Not when it is safe to ask questions, but when it still feels awkward. Not when the answers are clear, but when the questions are uncomfortable. Because once questioning feels dangerous, the direction no longer needs to be argued. It only needs to be managed. And that brings us to the final chapter, the narrow space that remains before everything feels settled. There is always a brief, uncomfortable window before acceptance becomes permanent, and that window closes without ceremony. No announcement marks its end. No signal alerts people that this is the last moment when awareness can still influence direction. It simply narrows as questioning feels less useful, as alternatives feel less imaginable, and as adaptation begins to feel like common sense. By the time the shift is obvious, the window has already closed, and awareness arrives too late to shape anything beyond personal understanding. This is the part most people misunderstand about 2026. They imagine a future moment when realization will suddenly spread, when everyone will look around and collectively acknowledge what has happened. But realization does not function that way. It arrives individually, unevenly, and often privately. And when it arrives late, it does not empower, it explains. It answers the question, how did we get here? After the direction has already been set. The window closes because humans are excellent at adaptation. We survive by normalizing conditions, not by constantly resisting them. Over time, the unfamiliar becomes familiar, the uncomfortable becomes manageable, and the questionable becomes routine. This is not failure. It is biology and psychology doing what they do best. But this same strength becomes a vulnerability when it replaces awareness with resignation. Once acceptance sets in, people rarely feel trapped. They feel realistic. They adjust expectations. They redefine success. They tell themselves, This is simply how the world works now. And because this adjustment happens internally, it does not feel imposed, it feels earned. That is why late awareness is so heavy. It recognizes the pattern after participation has already occurred. By 2026, many will not feel shocked by the state of the world. They will feel oriented within it. They will know how to navigate its rules, language, and limits. What they may not feel is the memory of when those limits were still flexible. Memory farthest quietly. Without memory of the baseline, loss becomes difficult to articulate. You cannot miss what you can no longer clearly remember. This is why early awareness matters, not as resistance, not as rebellion, but as orientation. Awareness does not stop change. It prevents internal capture. It allows a person to adapt consciously rather than automatically. Two people can live under the same conditions and experience entirely different realities based on whether they noticed the shift before the window closed. The person who noticed early does not live in denial or fear. They live with clarity. They recognize adaptation as adaptation, not destiny. They do not confuse normalization with inevitability. And because of that, they retain an inner reference point even as the external world changes. This difference is invisible from the outside. There will be no obvious sign separating those who saw early from those who adjusted without noticing. But internally, the difference is profound. One feels confused and constrained without knowing why. The other feels grounded, observant, and deliberate, not because conditions are better, but because perception remained intact. This is the ending most people never consider. Not collapse, not revelation, but quiet settlement. The moment when questions stop forming naturally, when curiosity gives way to coping. When the world feels stable again, just narrower than before, by the time something becomes obvious, it no longer invites challenge, it invites accommodation. The real question is not what 2026 will bring. It is whether you notice the shift before it felt complete. Because once the window closes, reality does not argue with you. It simply asks you to live inside what has already been accepted. And that is where the story truly ends, not with chaos, but with calm.